Hey, all you Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have not subscribed yet, welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be, every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you are interested in improving your company culture and building that culture of integrity that's going to help take us to the next level. We got a great episode for you today. It's all about busting unconscious bias and how to decode prejudiced psychology. It is happening in our workplaces. People feel excluded. People don't feel that level of belonging that leads to the employee engagement and the lower turnover that comes from an authentic culture of integrity. And we're going to be diving in with the one and only Heather Cummings today. Before that, we got a couple of quick announcements. Please give Heather a warm Ethicsverse welcome. We're trying to break records every single week. So what you can do to help this thing that we've all built together, this special community where it's our thing every single week, is invite your friends who might find some value from it, and follow us everywhere you can. So check out our YouTube channel. Round of applause for the one and only Big Boy Chase, who's built that YouTube channel and make us look very professional. All the replays are up there from our podcast, The Ethics Experts, and from the Ethicsverse. You can watch those while you're doing dishes or whatever. And follow us on LinkedIn as well. You can follow my personal page. You can follow the Ethico page. We put all the best clips, all the little bite-sized little snippets every single week. So check us out there. We, of course, we all say around here, readers are leaders. And so we love giving away books. The Ethicsverse, we give away books every single week. And we've added a couple of cool new books to the library. We're featuring Humanizing Rules again, because I just feel like it's germane to this conversation. And the more we can leverage behavioral science to drive our programs forward and make people feel the way we want them to feel, to engage these human sensors in our companies, the better. So we're going to be giving away, of course, 5 books today because we love you. So drop into the chat your LinkedIn URL, drop in tips. The more participation, the better. Your odds are at winning. Also wanted to shout out our good friend, Allison Taylor. She just put out a book this week called Higher Ground. It's all about, guess what? It's all about how we can build more ethical organizations. That book is getting a ton of buzz. We're going to have her on here soon. And that book is being added as well. I'm not done with the book yet, but I just know it's going to be a home run. So that's going to be added to the Ethico library as well. The Ethico ecosystem is your next-gen tool to start crowdsourcing more risk intelligence, to stop working for your tools and letting your tools work for you, with a next-gen solution that lets you get your job done more effectively. So look at all these awards we won. Round of applause to the Ethico dev team and the Ethico marketing team for winning us these awards time and time again. We're a company that's built on trying to provide tools that help make our workplaces better, and we can do that by getting information from people on the front lines and making investments in our tools so that we can have the next-gen tools. Why are we the last people in our organizations with next-gen tools? So if you're interested in that, definitely check us out. Here's the book spotlight. We have dozens and dozens of books, ethics and compliance books in the Ethico library. So if you want to see everything that's out there, hit that QR code. Mary's book is still flying off the shelves. That is 65 tips to level up your program. The Champions Network, I just saw another article about that recently. Christy Grant Hart's book, Wildly Effective Compliance Officer. So many great things out there, so much great thought leadership out there. So I encourage you to check those things out or just stop by the page and see if you can win one of those. Finally, there's a bunch of great podcasts out there. If you're not listening to those, you ought to. Check out the GalloCast, me and Gio, each month with the one and only Tom Fox. The FCPA Compliance Report is phenomenal. Little bite-sized snippets every morning while you're brushing your teeth. You can hear about the newest developments in the compliance world. And really, man, this Great Women in Compliance podcast, I just can't get enough of it. Lisa and Hema are really crushing it with this new iteration. They just put out a new episode that I'm about halfway through, so check that out. And then finally, the year of free service is still in effect. People are loving this year of free service. It's totally de-risking it for folks. So if you're thinking about changing something in your program over the next year or the next 18 months, it's worth having a conversation now to see how you can take advantage of this free year of service. Who loves you more than Ethico? I mean, we're giving away free years. We're giving away free books, webinars every single week. You know me. I'm Nick. How's it going? How do you like my hat this week? I was going to wear it, but I ended up leaving it at home. So apologies for that. And round of applause. Warm Ethicsverse welcome to Heather Cummings. She's the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager at Cornerstone On Demand. She is a DE&I manager and is a certified executive with over 20 years of expertise gained from ensuring inclusion through a positive work environment. So aside from the work Heather does with Cornerstone, she also provides DEI consulting for nonprofit, private, and public organizations. Heather, how's it going? Welcome.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks, Nick.
So as always, we want these to be lively. We take very seriously the hour that you spend with us every single week. So please drop questions into the chat. We will integrate them into the conversation. And remember, as we are really moving from this 2.0 that a lot of us find us in, where we're still cost centers, where we are still kind of the bumper sticker on the car, when we're moving to that true strategic lever in the organization where we're crowdsourcing risk intelligence and pushing risk insight at the point of risk, it's going to take us better understanding these human sensors that we're trying to activate in our organization. A huge impediment for turning people on, so to speak, and tapping into that belonging from a cultural perspective is this unconscious bias that exists within all of us as human beings. And I'm super excited to dive in, Heather. So I'm going to pass it to you, and I'll be moving my role into just chief interrupter. So I'll be interrupting you repeatedly throughout the next hour.
That'd be great. I'm looking forward to that. Hey, so great to be with you all today. So, of course, our conversation is going to be all wrapped around busting unconscious bias and looking at prejudiced psychology and how to decode that. So, to start, just to kind of cover some things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be discussing what bias is, how our brains work, and you know what those connections are to bias, and then types of unconscious biases. We'll look into ways that bias plays out, as well as where biases exist and ways to mitigate them. So first of all, I think what I want to start with is I want to ask you all, throw some words in the chat, like, what do you think bias is?
We're giving out points today, by the way, folks.
Well, some of you are adding some in there. I'm just going to start putting blind spot.
That's right. Beatrice, thank you. Preconceptions. Thank you, Carly. Preconceived notions, a feeling about something. Preconceived ideas, assumptions. Phenomenal. 1,000 points if I read yours so far, okay, to each of you, okay?
Great.
Leaning, I like that. Preference or aversion. That's pretty good. Hey, Amy, how's it going? Amy nailed it. Partiality, favoritism. This is great.
Yeah, these are spot on. So when we're talking about biases are the positive or negative associations in our mind toward people, places, and things. And the key is that it's all part of being human. So we all have biases. The goal is not to eliminate them, but to be mindful of them and learn how to be aware of them as it relates to decision-making processes. So when we're thinking about unconscious bias, it's also known as implicit bias. We're wanting to make sure that we're aware of, what those biases are. And the thing is that we've all had biases. We might think of them, we might see someone in how they dress, a haircut they have a certain way, sunglasses that we wouldn't be caught dead in, and we might think, oh, like that's awful. And then we meet that person and we get to know them, and they're the nicest person in the world, smartest person, someone we really want to engage with. So the thing with biases is that they play out all the time. So it's not a question of if a bias is at play, it's how. So when we're talking about that, we want to think about how they impact people. So qualified, talented people are denied opportunity every day due to bias. We must be intentional and proactive about how we're addressing bias. And it starts with recognizing our own biases and changing the way we make decisions. So in the long run, if biases are at play, they can affect equity. And an example of that, I'm sure some of you have seen things like the privilege walk, and where people fall if they're held back at certain points in their life multiple times. So crossing different areas of intersectionality or diversity dimensions can keep people from moving forward at a rate that someone else might not experience. An example could be just basic things like internships. If someone has an opportunity to experience an internship and someone else doesn't, there's biases at play in both them having had the opportunity and then also when someone hasn't had an opportunity. So as we kind of work through this, the important part of learning and understanding bias is discussing how our brains work.
So
we have,
real quick, Heather,
yeah.
before we get into this information exposure, how do you think about bias relative to preference? And are there cases where those are the same or different?
There's going to be cases where they're going to actually be the same. In preference, as we go through some of the examples of biases, we'll talk more about preference, but there's nothing wrong with having a preference, even if you're looking at who you surround yourself around, right? There's nothing wrong with preferences that you have and how you gravitate toward others that you prefer or things that you prefer. The challenge is when you don't go outside of those preferences and you're unconscious about those. So the biases that come up that are connected to your preferences then impede decisions that you make, which in turn create inequities.
So let me tell you about this scenario, and then you can tell me what you think about it. So my friend used to work at a hedge fund, and the hedge fund was run by a guy who went to Harvard. He had a full ride to Harvard, Ivy League guy, but he had a rule that he would never hire an Ivy League person. He would only hire people from state schools because in his experience, those folks were scrappier, they had more to prove, they ended up just being better employees. So what do you think about that bias? It's kind of going against Ivy League people, so maybe that's fine. Just kidding. But what do you think about that? I mean, that's a conscious bias for sure.
It is a conscious bias, and in a lot of ways, we're trying to get people to lean into making cognizant decisions more close to that. But at the same time, you don't want to rule out people who maybe come from an Ivy League school, just as you wouldn't want to.
Yale. Just kidding.
Unless it's exactly. It's a mix because you want to be able to look at everybody who's coming in. Now, the benefit of what your friend is doing is he's actually giving a chance to people who are going to not regularly have that chance. And it goes back to that example I gave of internships. So kudos to his decision in opening up through that lens. That's pretty powerful.
Cool. Thanks for that. Okay, on to information exposure. Tell us about this, how our brains work.
Yeah, so with information exposure, the big thing is that we're exposed to more than 11 pieces of information at any given time. And I want to ask you all, how many pieces of information do you think that our brain can actually handle? So put some of those numbers in the chat.
So how many of the 11 million pieces of information can we actually handle? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question. At any given time, how many pieces of information do you think our brains can actually handle?
I would say 1 million.
Okay.
6, 7.
Okay.
4, 2, 3 to 5. I guess I'm kidding. Now that I see these other answers, I must have been kidding about the million.
Well, so definitely is lower, right? So we've got some 1 millions, we've got quite a few lower numbers. Key is that our brains can only functionally handle about 40 pieces of information at any given time. Except if you're me, which it wouldn't be that many, it would probably be about 10. So in fact, even before in our planning for this call today, I told Joe and Nick, I was like, hey, just so you know, I don't multitask very well. So things that are going on in the chat, I'm probably not going to be able to keep up with. But this is a really important piece of information to know, because when we are exposed to that much information and our brain can only handle so much, it ends up giving us those inaccurate shortcuts lead to exclusion. So unconscious biases are triggered between 30 and 100 milliseconds, where conscious thinking takes 300 milliseconds to even begin processing. So let's talk about what that actually
that's 10 times. That's like a 10x difference.
Yes.
Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And we're talking milliseconds here. Okay.
Milliseconds. Mm-hmm. So Daniel Kahneman had written the book Fast, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in his book, he tries to break it down for us into two systems. System one, which is really we're thinking fast in our thoughts. We operate automatically. We can go through a vast amount of information with little effort, driven by our intuition and emotions. The thing with these fast shortcut type thinkings is that this is our lazy brain. So, and it's not necessarily negative. It's important that we have the ability for fast thinking and for slow thinking, because we have so much information that's being thrown at us that we need to be able to process information many times quickly. Fast thinking is a primal survival mechanism. So it's using heuristics, cognitive shortcuts to quickly reply to threats. Of course, we definitely needed those, many years ago, but we still need those today. And there's a book called Blink that it talks a little bit about that fast thinking. I don't think that author uses the term fast thinking per se, but it's those instinctual thoughts that go and feelings that we have before our brain can actually process fully what's going on. And it allows us to make, some really important, quick decisions. Now, again, those decisions can be inaccurate and they can lead to exclusion. So when we're talking about this other aspect, it leads into slow thinking. And the key with slow thinking is that it really is, it's taking time. It's our thinking brain. So it requires attention, it requires effort. It helps regulate system one. Without system two, if we were only relying on system one, we would probably run into a lot of trouble many times and many inaccurate decisions. But it is hard and deliberate. It's our more rational brain, and it's definitely more reliable. So these two systems are really important in understanding biases.
So I just love that book, and I love the system one, system two thinking. It's been such an impact on my life and how I kind of view the world. And I mean, we really do live in that system one. That system one is our alligator brain, that sort of reactionary thing. This is where a jump scare occurs, to your point. We really do live here. And so much of our decision making happens down here that we end up inadvertently or maybe unconsciously rationalizing with our system two brain, right? So we think we live in our system two. We think that we're these rational beings that are intaking data, spitting out the most logical ones and zeros. That's how we think we actually live. But so much of our decision-making actually occurs below that layer of consciousness. It happens in that subconscious system one. And again, our job as ethics and compliance and human resource folks who are trying to build a culture of integrity, our job is to figure out how to pick all these locks being the human beings in our organization. In order to be a lockpicker, because I'm an amateur lockpicker, by the way, in order to be a lockpicker, you have to understand how locks work. And so if we're going to ever actualize the human beings in our organization and turn them into the human sensors that are part of the risk management process and part of the culture building, initiative, then we have to understand how they work. And if we're not taking time to think about, in system two, think about how these folks work, then the odds that our efforts sort of fall flat are exponentially higher,
Such a great point, Nick. I think that what's really challenging is that because we live in such a fast-paced world, we don't have a lot of time. So a lot of times that system one just becomes what we do all the time. And we don't need it to be. Like even just taking a short pause to ask ourselves, was that thought that I just had accurate? Like, is that really what it is? Because it doesn't take much time to do that, but it feels like it does until first we identify what our own biases are and we start paying attention to them.
And if I can add something to that, like if you think about a newborn baby kind of doesn't have that system two developed, right? Yeah. So everything you see from them is kind of a system one reaction. If they get a hunger pain, they start crying. If there's a loud noise, they get scared and they start crying, right? And as we age and as we get more mature, we can start to manage, as Heather said, we can start to use our system 2 to manage those things so that, if I didn't have a system 2, I'd be weeping right now because I haven't had lunch yet, right? So I now can manage those hunger pangs and I'm not crying like a newborn baby as a result of it. But it took myself, my system 2 brain to start to understand the source of those feelings and do something else with them instead of, acting out and crying like a child. So again, that framework, we've already done this. We've done what Heather is talking about multiple times throughout our lives. And we're now going to be applying this kind of a framework or this kind of a structure to these things that are happening below, in system 1, these biases, these cognitive errors that we're all kind of plagued with because we're all human beings.
I know I mentioned.
I got to add this. Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but I did say I'm chief interrupter today, so sorry about that.
You're good. You're good.
I asked, BH said, I ask all the time, should I react like this? Pause, go with second reaction. And that's exactly what we're talking about in the context of the biases. That's phenomenal.
Exactly. Yeah, it really is. And I don't I want to caution us that it doesn't have to be in everything that we have to take a pause, right? But when we're making decisions about people, and it has to do with, our work environment and not just in work. I mean, everywhere we go, we really need to be thinking, what is that? And at least just take a pause. But I go back to that book, Blink. Malcolm Gladwell he wrote the book Blink. That one has a whole other aspect of when we're talking about our system 1, even though he doesn't call it system 1, but when we're talking about those feelings and thoughts that come up initially, which is that system 1 that Daniel Kahneman talks about, what that means and how to lean into that's important. It's equally important. It's just different. And if we're always living in that 1 and we're not moving into the system 2, it's really not going to allow us to be rational and make solid decisions. It will create a lot of inaccuracies. So both are important, but taking just a beat to slow down is really key. And sometimes for me, I tend to live more in the system 2 than I do system 1, which can slow me down in some ways. And then in other ways, it can really, it can slow me down in a way that's going to allow for more positive things to happen for the environments and those people that I'm working with. So I think we have to find a balance in between both systems.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, that intentionality at some level is rooted in system 2. So to the extent you're being intentional or you're being measured or you're, you know what I mean? That's all system 2 stuff, right?
Exactly. So when we're thinking about unconscious bias, this next section that we're going to go into, it's going to give all these examples of different biases. And before we go in that, I just want to say there are tons of biases, of different types of biases. It's not essential that you know the names of all of them, even though that's what we're getting ready to talk about. I don't want anybody to get a little put off by it because there's so many names. I want you to just start going back to the system 1, system 2 thinking and understanding why system 2 is important. And when you have a thought that creeps in that appears to be a bias, it's important to stop and take that pause. It's not essential that you are able to identify, well, this is this type of bias and this is this type of bias, because they're going to keep coming and keep getting added. But let's talk about how they play out, what some of them are, and what we see in our workplaces quite frequently. So some of these here, I'm sure you all have experienced when we're looking at some of them, like for instance, halo and horn bias. This is really occurring when you have, you end up taking you see something, a trait or something, an attribute in someone that's either good or bad, and you attach it to that individual, and then you hold on to it. You don't let any other information change your thought about that person. So you can see in this visual, in the first one, there's an attribute 1, the person is has given one thing that has been a positive attribute, and then because of that, even though there's 2 other attributes that don't support it, you would link onto that. So an example is it appears like when an employee is highly competent or incompetent in one area, and a supervisor rates that employee correspondingly high or low in all areas. Just before I go on, I'm hearing a feedback on my end. No one else is, right?
Oh, so Beatrice just said the echo is back.
It's back. Okay. Let me see if I put my headset in, if that helps.
Okay. So the halo horn bias, this is kind of what I described before with my buddy's hedge fund, So, they could have had, a bunch of great attributes, attribute 2 and 3, but if a candidate was from a private school, then, okay, everybody's hearing it. So if you're hearing it on me, then please let me know.
I'm not hearing it now. Now when I'm talking, I am. Do you all hear that again?
Okay. So yeah, I mean, we see that all the time. How's it? Are you hearing it? No. Okay. It's not on me. Okay. So I guess I'm taking this over. I'm just kidding. So why don't we keep going, and we can see if it keeps popping up.
I know at one point it sounded like you muted, and then I didn't, and then there wasn't an echo. I don't know if that's the difference or not. But let me bring.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah, let's just blame AT&T after the disaster from today. Maybe this is an AT&T thing.
Sorry, y'all. I can also probably connect in a different way. Let me see. Let me see on my video or my audio. Hold on 1 second.
Okay, so confirmation bias. You want to try it now?
Does that sound any different? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it sounds different to me.
Okay, I can't hear any.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Right. Okay, great. Okay, so when we're looking at confirmation bias, that's really going to look at where there's a tendency to search for or interpret or favor information in a way that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs and values. So you can see, with all of the little pieces of information there, the ones that are fewest support what that person is thinking, so they grab onto it. And we've seen this happen again and again with things like leniency bias. It's giving favorable ratings to an individual with notable room for improvement. Maybe if like someone has just had a really hard day and you say, well, they should get a good performance review, even though they've had a really hard, they haven't had the best year. It's because they're going through something that's, causing that. That's leniency bias. So you can see, sometimes these biases have positive intent behind them, but they are still a bias that can cause some pain and hurt in the long run. Recency bias might be if something recent happened and then you just put that, you favor a recent event over historical ones. It's like a memory bias. Affinity bias happens, when you tend to favor people who share a similar interest or background, like favoritism toward a particular gender. So these are some things like with attribution bias, that's the tendency to explain a person's behavior by referring to their character rather than any situational factor. So let's play some of these out and talk about what that might look like. And actually, before we go on, does anyone know of any other biases that they would have added to this list that they can call off in the chat?
Okay, so while we're doing that, I'd love to kind of dive in while we're waiting for those to populate in the chat. I'd love to hear a little bit more about this latency bias or this leniency bias. Hello.
Yeah.
Because as you said, I think a lot of these biases do end up being rooted sometimes in something valid, right? It's the right intent and so forth. But I'd love to learn a little bit more about that that leniency bias and where you've seen that play out for folks.
Of course. So with leniency bias, if as it relates to giving favorable ratings to an individual with, notable room for improvement, we the way that we've seen this is, maybe if someone has had, and this is, I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression with this particular bias, because it's not always a terrible bias, but it can affect things. So if someone has just had a death in their family, and they're in the middle of maybe a performance review, and prior to that they had a really bad year, and there were things that they weren't able to meet some of those expectations and goals set, it might mean that a manager ends up giving a score, or their performance review might be a higher review than it would have been had someone in that individual's family not passed away. And it's really trying to be your bias. You have a bias to try to protect that person. So it can be bad and good, right? Like you want to be very clear. So when in situations like that, you have to ask yourself, removing that factor of that leniency that you might be giving them, if what you're doing is actually, if how you're interacting with them, or it could even be a promotion that you're looking at, moving them into a role that maybe they're not ready for, but because they're going through something, you want to just open that door, but it might ultimately not be the best decision to support them, putting them at risk, or to support even your company. So that would be an example. Does that kind of lean into helping understand the difference in what leniency bias is? Seeing some others in here, like hindsight bias, bandwagon effect. Yep, introvert, extrovert, like me bias, observer bias. All right. I'm gonna go on to the next slides. I'm not hearing an echo, but I'm also hearing a lot of quiet. So if something happens and I lose you all, please let me know, Nick or Joa. All right. So let's talk a little bit about affinity bias. Does anyone know? I know I had given you some examples of what affinity bias is, but let's think about some examples of affinity bias. So where we might see affinity bias can happen in things like the recruitment selection process, in some telltale signs, and this is really important with these biases. A lot of times, good, I'm seeing no echo. A lot of times you're going to hear like signs that will say that there's a bias. So the more that you're aware of biases in general, you don't even have to, again, know the type of bias it is. You'll start hearing language that is indicative of those biases. So in this case, when you hear someone say, oh, they're a right fit for the company, or we just clicked, those aren't necessarily bad comments, but they could indicate that there's a bias there. So that's when especially in a recruitment selection process. So some things that we want to be aware of, and why is the why behind these biases. So we don't want to rock the boat a lot of times, and that's where you'll see affinity bias play out. It tends to happen a lot. Like if you look at it from a gender perspective, if there's a team of primarily men on a team, and only one woman, and they're they're hiring for a position on that team, you might see the woman even lean into hiring another man just to support that idea of not rocking the boat, or being in the same way of thinking. A lot of times it's just not wanting to have controversy, and it's a path of least resistance. So those are things with affinity bias that can creep up. And Confirmation bias, we can kind of walk through a couple of examples of this. We're going to see it a lot in things like selection process, promotions, project assignments, telltale signs, or maybe comments like, is he old enough? Or they live too far away. So those are some things that we might, come through. The picture is an example. When we think of a doctor and a nurse, many times the opposite is of what is shown. So another couple of examples: every man knows how to fix a car, or every woman knows how to bake. Confirmation bias is really occurring from the direct influence or desire on beliefs. So when people would like a certain concept or idea to be true, and then they end up believing it to be true. So why we do this, it's quick and there's no assessment required. So it goes back to that system 1, system 2. And groupthink, of course, is an issue both for the confirmation bias and before. I just noticed in the chat. Halo and horn is another thing that we run into. Where you see halo and horn bias is in evaluation processes and the selection processes. Some telltale signs. They recently, did a great job in this project, or, oh, he always, acts like that in those meetings. So those are telltale signs that, we're grabbing onto a negative or positive attribute that might not actually be telling of an individual's whole experience. And we do this because it reinforces our beliefs. It's quick and convenient, and it doesn't require us to challenge or to dig deep. So again, back to the system 1 and system 2. So I want to take a pause real quick before I'm going to have us play out some biases at play and put them up there and ask you what biases you think might be at play. And I just want to take a moment to field any thoughts or questions that are coming up. And Nick, I'll have you help me out with that. I'm not hearing anything either. Oh, Nick. Okay, I'm reading now that Nick is.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you now.
Hear me? Oh,
yeah.
Great. Okay, I'm back. What are we talking about? Just kidding. Okay, keep going.
No worries. It's so funny. It got really silent, and then I'm like, okay, am I still here? Is everyone still with me?
I do have a question for you. How would you, back to the leniency bias, how would you kind of define the line? This is a great question from Crystal. How would you define the line between empathy and leniency bias?
I would say that empathy shouldn't determine a big decision that I might not word this the correct way, but it shouldn't determine a big decision that'll impact someone over a long period of time. So, and what I mean by that is that if we're looking at, if you were feeling you want to have empathy toward people, that's so important, right? But if the empathy is clouding your decisions that will affect that other person, which might affect them positively initially, but actually could affect them negatively long term, that's something that you don't want to do. And some examples, if you keep from sharing with someone, maybe they've been in meetings lately where they've been coming off pretty negatively toward other people, and that's affecting the overall team culture. But maybe that person is going through something, and you keep it from them, from talking to them about it, because you want to have empathy for them and you feel bad what they're going through. But long term, it can affect that individual's standing in their team. that's when you have to make that call just to say, hey, I know you're going through a lot, but this is something that we really, that I want to just share with you. And I want to know ways, that I can support you in helping you when we're on these calls. So that could be an example, but that's on a minor level. A larger level to that could be you promote someone because they're going through a hard time and you want to be lenient with them, but they're not ready for the promotion. And in the long run, it hurts them. So
yeah,
that's
so
where we
it
really
seems
have
like that,
to be mindful.
maybe this is going to butcher it, but like the empathy is sort of situational. It's sort of like pausing accountability in your example versus like leniency is not temporal at all. It's permanent. And it's like shutting accountability off or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't want to be in those spaces. It just in the long run for everybody, it creates a negative situation. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah, of course. Now we have to click through all these real quick. Hold on. There we go. All right. So biases at play. I'm going to just throw some of these up here and you tell me in the chat what you think they are. So this particular one, we have, sorry, I'm trying to go through my slides here. There we go. All right. So a person was 10 minutes late to the last touch base. Because of that, they're then known as not demonstrating the behaviors of high potential. So when we're thinking about that bias, what type of bias do you think that is? All right. I'm going to go ahead and just let you all know recency, okay?
Smart. Wow. BH, smart. Joa. Recency. What would you say?
It definitely is attribution bias, but it could be recency too. And that's the other thing to note. That's why I always say you don't necessarily need to know the names of all of these, but you know that there's a bias at play many times. Now, if they're constantly 10 minutes late, then you have to dig deeper. What if that person is really, there's something going on in their life that's impacting them to be 10 minutes late? Do we need to talk about moving that touch base? Is it impacting the touch base? Does it actually mean that they're not a high potential? It just depends on what the situation is, but just making the call, whether it be a recency bias or an attribution bias, it's still, there's something else going on. So you want to dig a little deeper. So let's look at this next one. They went to Harvard. I can personally attest, as I'm an alumnus myself, that they're high potential. So if you heard a man saying this, or alumna, a woman, or a person saying this, what type of bias do you think that this would be? Affinity bias. Yep, it is an affinity bias for sure. All right, let's look at this next one. They don't always turn their camera on in meetings. I don't think they're engaged.
I think that's just being a good manager, that one. That's just being a manager. I'm just kidding. We're a camera on company. Okay.
I can totally relate to that. Yep, I get it. I totally get it. So this one could be like a horn bias or an attribution bias. But again, we have to ask ourselves, what is going on? And, are they actually engaged? Because they might be engaged and it might actually have nothing to do with that. So those are important. Let's look at a couple other ones.
Before we move on to that one, hey, yeah. Wendy, what's happening? The one and only Wendy, she always adds something so good. Listen to this story. I once interviewed for a job where all the people in the department were white men, all of whom went to the same college at different times, and 2 of whom were college roommates. It was a huge red flag for me that there were no other women in the department, that the women who had worked there left after a short period because they didn't, quote unquote, fit in. While I want to rock the boat, shake up the status quo where it makes sense and get in, quote unquote, get in good trouble. I love that. There did not seem to be a way to crack that nut. So I think she brings up something really interesting, as usual, and something really smart. When you're looking for a new job, it's a two-way street, right? Of course, you want a new job, but
Yeah.
but you should be interviewing them just as much. And if you're so blinded by, or you're so focused on like coming across well, you start to, shut off some of those senses you have, and you might kind of miss some things. So good on Wendy for seeing those red flags as they were and seeing what the past experiences have been for other folks. I mean, you have to be able to kind of assess, even if it's possible to get in good trouble, as Wendy said, but also assess the extent to which you're able to make an impact. And if you're stepping into an organization that's really plagued by some of these biases, they might not know it. They might like, showing up on Monday with everybody wearing the same polos with the same colors on them. But like, if you're not tuning into those things, you could find yourself in kind of a bad spot and feel kind of stuck. And you also want to kind of see, like, is this something that I can even change? There's a lot of organizations that have that kind of good boys club type of a thing. And you have to make, your career is just a bunch of bets. You're betting on time, and you're betting on focus, and you're betting on effort. That might not be a high probability bet for you to really thrive in that kind of an organization. So looking for those red flags is super, super critical.
And I want to say an important thing to just remember too is that for some people, they can make that call to look elsewhere, right? So we want to make sure that we look at those red flags. And if we have the ability to find work elsewhere, because that's where we also want to talk a little bit about our privilege, right? So for some people, they might be in an area maybe where there's not as many jobs. Maybe they can't get a remote job, and they end up landing into this place that you've described as a female, as a woman, not able to fully fit in, and in a really hard place to make an impact. At the same time, they might not actually have as many opportunities to find work elsewhere. So what does that mean for them? Maybe it might be a temporary position that they're in. But I say that to say these decisions that we take for granted sometimes, not everybody has the ability to make those decisions. So any impact that can be made in the place that you're in, some of you might actually be in those places right now. I hope not, but some of you might. And I would say even if it's just, mentioning, hey, I noticed that, we constantly lean on pulling in people into the team that are male, and there's only, so many female, bringing data in and research that support that. Those are all really important things to do if you're in those situations currently, or if you end up getting into a situation in the future where you don't have as many options as some others might have. But yeah,
on the other side of this bias discussion, Carly just shared this story, and I think thanks for sharing it. First of all, Carly, I'm going to read it here in a second. It's in the chat, so you guys can grade me at how well I read to an audience. But we're seeing the other side of what a biased organization, or what an organization that doesn't exude inclusivity can feel for somebody. So listen to what Carly wrote. After being the only woman in the room, which was not uncommon in automotive for me, I would have to be very excited about the opportunity to return to that. It can be very exhausting to modify behavior / language to communicate and integrate in that environment. And I think she just summed up how somebody who doesn't feel that kind of belonging, or feels the victim of, or they feel like an outsider, or they feel the victim of some kind of collection of these unconscious biases, there is a ton of wasted effort. And this is why, to me, this is such an important conversation. Those were wasted calories that, I don't want to say wasted because she did it in error. She had to do that in order to feel like she had to fit in, because there weren't steps taken by that organization or the people in the room that she described to make her feel that way. So she had to spend, needless calories to, as she said, modify behavior and language to communicate and integrate with that environment. And so there's always going to be some of that, right? As you're in a group and, being part of that group and so forth. But what a waste. And now this industry has lost a great person who wouldn't normally come back to that, given the experience that they've had. And so these kinds of experiences are happening. I mean, they've definitely happened to me. I'm sure they've happened to you, Heather. They've happened to all of us to some degree. And it's a question of, like, are we going to take those extra steps to raise our awareness? As I saw a handful of things in the chat of, if I have that kind of a feeling, can I pause for a second and can I analyze that and see if that's the right feeling? Is there some kind of bias in this? Am I making this person feel excluded unnecessarily? And again, let's bring this back down to earth. This is not about touchy-feely things necessarily. This is about us creating workplaces where people can put their gifts to work, where we can have participants, where we can have human sensors, we can have participants in the sort of risk management process. In order for that to happen, people have to feel a certain way, because guess what? I'm not the only one who lives in system one. Everybody lives in system one. And so if somebody has that kind of excluded feeling, or that feeling of being the victim of some of these biases, that is going to be a recurring theme for them in all of their interactions in that environment until something changes. And there's a lot of employee disengagement that's rooted in the stuff that we're talking about. And that's why I think it's an important conversation, because you're never going to have an authentic culture of integrity where people feel like they're part of something if you're not authentically trying to close the gap between that aspirational and real culture and weed out these biases that are affecting the employee experience.
Yeah, and a lot of times organizations will focus on the talent acquisition aspect of it, thinking that that's going to solve it. But really, if your environment itself isn't conducive to inclusive practices, it's not going to retain employees. So even if you bring in diverse employees, even if you bring more women into the company, more Black or Latin employees into the company, more employees with disabilities. If the environment is not inclusive for those employees coming in, they're not going to stay. And then you're going to be in the same space that you were in before. So it really does
and it's
take
going to
inner
reinforce
work.
this thing. And it's going to reinforce this feeling that those other diverse folks are going to have. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to jump ahead a little bit to data around this too, because there's some important points. A lot of times people think that unconscious bias is just an HR problem and that HR should train it and fix it away. But that's not the case. Some of it's going to come from where we, from our teams talking about it, bringing up, calling out biases that are present, having the courage to do that. And even before I talk too much about this data and why DEIB is so important to organizations, I think what's really important is that each of us, we have a responsibility to be aware of our own bias. And when it's positive and it helps us, like in a fight or flight situation, and when, or a freeze situation, and when it hurts us and it hurts the organizations that we work for and the environments that we're in. So it's really important for us to first look at ourselves, and then for us to not stay silent, but to actually speak of what we're noticing and talk about ways to make these changes. And as leaders in those organizations, it's our absolute responsibility to do that. So we all have a role in that. And the one thing I want to say, just as a takeaway to that piece, is that many times we put the responsibility on our underrepresented groups and our underrepresented employees to be the ones to speak to this. And that's absolutely wrong. Like those who have the majority and privilege in an organization are the ones who should be the sponsors and the advocates and those speaking to this the most, not putting it on underrepresented groups to do so. So I want to just zoom into some important points. When organizations are acting on DEIB, it's again not just an HR problem. You're going to see that when they're acting on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, 18% are more effective at creating a positive employee experience. Your turnover rates are 4% lower than those not acting on DEI. Organizations it's huge. It is huge.
4% is a lot. When you start to quantify how much it costs to onboard new people, even if you go on the low end of those estimates that are out there of 6 months, that is a lot. That's a lot of salary. That's a lot of waste in the system from unnecessary, I would call that unnecessary turnover, Yeah,
exactly. When we're looking at, even when you look at this from a generational perspective, this is important to know. 40% of millennials now select employers because of social impact initiatives. Social impact initiatives include diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which unconscious bias is part of, right? It's our day-to-day ways of working and being aware of our biases. Well, millennials and Generation Z are the most diverse in history. So when you're balancing all of that, this leads into other aspects. So we can talk about the EBIT margin. Organizations are 33% more likely to outperform with greater cultural and ethnic diversity. And when organizations act on DEI, they achieve 3 times the revenue growth compared to less inclusive organizations. So these are hard, these are hard numbers that speak louder than anything that we can speak about as it relates to unconscious bias, but how you feel. And everybody at some point, whether you are a white male or you are, a Latin female, or you are a transgender, student, at any point in your experience, you've felt bias. Like all of us have felt bias. That's not we've had people have a lens toward us that has probably seethed bias in some ways. And on the other hand of it, we've all acted on bias without, and we have to remember that, these biases that we experience and we go through, sometimes they're important in helping us in really critical situations that are dangerous. But many times if we don't put them in check, it's going to hurt us. So I say all that to say, these numbers are important and we all make a difference. And I want to kind of just walk through some really important pieces that will look at, ways where they exist and ways, strategies that we can use. So we know that in programs like when we're looking at applications when we're writing offer letters, setting minimum qualifications, pre-screening, video interviews, biases can exist throughout that. They can exist in our external website, in our sourcing selection, our resume screening. So some things that we can do is examine wording. There's bias checkers and a lot of language checkers that we can use to help prevent some of this. When we're looking at interview applications, we can mask a person, their name, their school, their location, so we don't pick up on any of these pieces that might hold us back as it relates to biases. We can access competencies such as problem solving. So again, you biases might exist and, minimum requirements to advance or capping increases or hard, fast rules, when it comes to time in the office. So some strategies around that: embracing variability in the process, measure results not on hours, but be remote, flexible, and job sharing. So it's not about hours that are going to solve and complete a person's work. Looking at programs like your development programs or your performance reviews. What are your personality based? When we're thinking about where they might exist, it could be within the annual your annual performance process or your rating scales. So eliminate forced ranking. Offer stretch assignments, look at peer reviews, include competencies, do competency comparisons among your managers, and they go on, right? So embedding it in your culture is really important. I'm going to skip through this one because I know we're almost
Too bad. I love
time.
a good Venn diagram. Too bad.
I'm sorry. I know we're at time, so I'm like, oh. So some key takeaways: embrace differences, look past the obvious. Okay, so don't think that that single parent that comes in, that they're just your diversity dimensions don't need to they shouldn't just be looking at gender, race and ethnicity, and veteran or disability status, which are EEOC scores on, right? Like, look past the obvious. This is to other aspects of diversity dimensions. Attend to data and evidences. Break apart your talent acquisition funnel. Communicate clearly. Key is that you know the signs. It's important, and it's your responsibility to get conscious of what unconscious bias is. Harvard's implicit bias checker, they have all these assessments you can go and take, really interesting, on biases and different types of biases. I recommend go and look for it. Harvard's implicit bias association test.
I aced
ask
mine.
Questions.
I aced my Harvard test. Yeah. So,
which one did you take?
I took them all. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I did take one a while back. I did take one a while back, and it's a really interesting. It's a really interesting test, and it's worth the 5 or 10 minutes it takes to take it. Again, I love this topic because it's just one aspect of this culture of integrity that I think a lot of us are really excited about building and really have a vision for in our organizations. And, the average employee is not drawing a line between what ethics covers or what compliance covers or what, employee relations covers. They're thinking about what they're doing after work, and they're living in the feeling that's in that system one. So really anything we can do to prove our commitment to, again, closing that gap between the culture people are living out and the aspirational culture, and the more clear we can convey our vision for what that culture looks and feels like, both from a diversity standpoint, from a belonging standpoint, from an integrity standpoint, or a participation standpoint, the more clear we can be about that, and the more effort we can put forward that's tangible, that people can see, the easier it is to convince everybody that this is a real thing, that we're genuinely, putting authentic effort behind. That's how we can hit that tipping point that starts to cause the level of engagement that is going to allow us to ascend to that compliance or that ethics or that cultural 3.0, level that we're striving toward. So we have to use all these different things for our advantage and take advantage of these things that are top of mind for folks. And once we can understand how the wiring of these, how the wiring of these human sensors in our organization, we're going to be better able to engage them, turn them on, and bring them into this risk management, culture building process that we're all, a part of.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Nick. This is such an important conversation, and a 1-hour conversation on unconscious bias is just the very top tip, right? So you have to dig deeper, but the key takeaway, start being aware of your own biases and know that some, they're mostly unconscious. And that's the important part, is that how do you fix something that you don't know even exists? That's where you have to start being aware of them and dig a little bit deeper. So I really appreciate all of you joining us today.
So we're going to be talking about this whole inclusion thing a little bit more next week. We're going to be talking about microaggressions and macro inclusion. Again, no one is going to be an active participant in your culture of integrity and be that cultural guardian or that cultural ad unless they feel like they're part of something. So how do we make people feel like they're part of something and reduce the protectionism that everybody has? You feel stupid when you're putting your effort towards something and it ends up being fake, right? So how can we show that our desire to build this culture of integrity is real? And we're going to do that together. We're going to be diving into that next week. So where can people find you, Heather?
Oh, yeah. There we go. Sorry. There we go. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. And that is my contact information as well. So take note of it. And I'm, always here to have those conversations. This is an important topic, and it leads into a lot of other aspects around diversity and inclusion. So
thank you all for joining. Thank you for those of you who stayed a little bit past the hour. I hope you join us next week for our next Ethics Verse episode. And a round of applause for Heather on the way out, and we'll see you next week. Thanks again, Heather.
Hey, thanks everyone. Bye.